The native people of the Maldives are the only indigenous island culture with ancient history and mythology contained within the northern Indian Ocean. Some of the lack of information regarding their history and culture is due partially to the fact that there are few written records or archaeological sites on the islands. What remained from previous centuries was likely washed away or disintegrated due to exposure, as the Maldives consists entirely of coral atolls lying on an underwater volcanic range. Even though the ancient Maldivian culture remains somewhat intact in the modern era, the Buddhist, Hindu, and animistic traditions that predate Islam are difficult to determine. What can be learned of these ancient people is found in their myths, which often resemble those of neighboring Sri Lanka and South India. The Maldives includes nearly 1,200 small islands in the Indian Ocean. The archipelago is located southwest from Sri Lanka, and India about 430 miles from the Indian subcontinent. Of the 1,200 islands, only about 200 are inhabited, and there are few cities with significant populations. Today, there are close to 400,000 Maldivians who are ethnically distinct as a homogeneous group. Many of the population still reside in the scattered villages and hold on to traditional customs. Each atoll and island within have unique characteristics and different variations of common myths, yet all have a deep background in indigenous spirituality. Some of the Maldivian Muslims' pre-Islamic beliefs still shape their way of life. In fact, in previous centuries, the Maldivians were known for their magicians, and their folklore is full of tales about sorcerers. As time wore on, however, the folklore which was passed down orally became all that remained of these former periods. Islam in the Maldives, officially introduced in 1153 AD, was met by elements of animism, Buddhism, and ancient Hinduism. The old practices included various rituals performed to ward off evil spirits and to evade disease and death, while also telling stories to illustrate how one should behave. Modernization and globalization have also influenced these traditional practices, which endanger the memory of the Maldivian people and their unique ancient culture. To understand Maldivian culture in its ancient expressions, one must consider the influence of its neighboring countries. Being an archipelago in the Indian Ocean, the islands have relied on trade with nearby civilizations for millennia. Bengal, India, and Ceylon were significant trade partners due to their proximity, yet travelers from Arabia also heavily influenced the Maldivian or Dhivehi people. The location of the atolls along maritime trade routes in the Indian Ocean also brought foreigners from distant places to the shores of the Maldives from time to time. These exchanges formed the basis for the Maldivian way of life from early in its history. Some archaeological evidence suggests that the Maldives was inhabited before 1500 BC, with the first settlers likely being Dravidian people from India and Sri Lanka. From around the 3rd century BC to the 12th century AD, the Maldivians were a predominantly Buddhist people who built and maintained stupas and temples across the archipelago. Further speculation by early scholars such as H.C. Bell suggests that Hinduism and local folk religions were also a thriving part of everyday life. Though Buddhism in the Maldives can be verified archaeologically, the earlier religion, which drew from Hinduism and animism, can only be located in the oral myths that have been passed down. These myths often correspond to Hindu mythology from the mainland of India and Sri Lanka around the same time periods. Islam was introduced to the Maldives in the 12th century AD at the time of the expansion of the Abbasid Caliphate. From that point until the present, Islam has been the primary religious influence in the Maldives. A Moroccan traveller named Abu al-Barakat Yusuf al-Barbari is credited with converting the Maldivian king, King Thimuj, to Islam in the year 1153 AD. However, the pre-Islamic practices did not disappear under the new Maldivian Sultanate, but rather absorbed Islam into their already existent beliefs. Despite being geographically isolated from the Arabian Peninsula, the Maldivians have historically modeled their society after the example of Arabian countries. Arab culture has influenced the Maldivian language, writing system, and the political landscape. It was in the capital city of Malé that the sultans ruled and relayed their policies to the chiefs and elders on the outlying atolls. The village life of traditional Maldivians can reveal some of the unique indigenous tendencies of their people. Prior to the 1940s, most of the islands with villages on them would not have looked any different than the uninhabited islands when viewed from the sea. This is because the villagers built their homesteads inland and surrounded the settlements with thick groves of coconut trees and shrubbery. There were no homes that had ocean views, with the exception of sheds that may have been used for boat building. This is because the salt spray from the sea would wreak havoc on the breadfruit, papaya, and banana trees if they were exposed. As well, the Maldivians believed that to look long at the sea would cause one's heart to turn to stone. Such superstitions drove the Maldivians as far inland as possible. The interior forested village was connected to the sea by a series of winding, shaded paths. These were designed with winding turns in order to trick mischievous ancestral spirits called Kadovi, who could only walk in straight lines. In the village, the trees and homes seemed to blend into the land itself, with each hut also put into proper orientation with the sky by the village astronomer, or Nakateria. Aside from the spiritual significance of Maldivian life, the village was generally a quiet and quaint place. The writer H.C. Bell, upon his visit, described the islands as follows: "Houses there are in plenty, but so well embowered and hidden by sheltering fences and skillful adaptation as to give the effect of a close-set, rustic village. Though the Maldivians resided in the innermost parts of the island, their way of life was shaped by the sea. Men and women used the sea frequently, and the path that opened to the beach was considered an important place in the village. This path represented a spiritual border as well as a physical border to the Maldivian people. The enormity of the ocean surrounding them was ever present on the small areas of land on which they dwelt. Out of this intimidation came themes of chaos against order, with the sea characterizing chaos and the atoll thought to be perfectly spherical, representing order. Mosques or temples and stupas before Islam, with homes and streets, were frequently weeded and cleaned as a way to increase their orderliness. This purity distinguished the inhabited portions of an island from the unprotected and chaotic places. This belief in inauspicious locations would often cause Maldivians to react to chaos in extreme ways. For example, if a deadly plague were to come to a particular island, it would be completely abandoned right away, as the location was thought to be compromised by evil spirits. Such a conundrum could only be solved by relocating. However, even on a healthy island, natural chaotic spaces such as the beach and the jungle were accepted. Additionally, there were pockets of unprotected space within the village itself, including the dark corners behind the house where the latrine and trash were located. The influence of dark spirits, or Vigani, in the village affected the ways in which the temples and mosques were built. As a sacred space, they were aligned with the stars in accordance with a mandala pattern, owing to their ancient overlap with Buddhism. This alignment with the sky weakened the attacks of demonic Vigani spirits, as certain angles were considered auspicious and thus protective. In addition to aligning their homes and buildings with the sky, Maldivians to this day incorporate various hollow stones which a sorcerer lays in the foundation before construction. This would be a way to ensure the success and prosperity of the home and those living in it. The mandala-shaped layout of the home provided a blessing that would bring order out of chaos and thus ward away evil spirits. In village buildings as well as boat construction, sanctified space was an important concept. Most Maldivian seacraft was also designed with the mandala structure in mind, and the shape of the boat itself would be a part of the preparation for the long voyages. Since Maldivians thought of the atolls they lived in as having a perfect geometric shape, they considered the inner lagoon safer than the open sea. Even small decorative gestures around the home and the village were used to provide the maximum protection from evil through orderliness. It is customary, for example, to plant an auspicious plant called kandolu on the four corners of a house. This plant is also abundant in the mosques which dot the island. Many island villages in the Maldives also had sacred trees which represented auspicious zones for the locals. These trees could be the banyan and biogas trees, which are noted for their height, towering over the local flora and giving an island a recognizable look which made it easy to identify from the sea. There are very few stories of Maldivian folklore that are available in English, especially before the 20th century. As one source, the travelogues of medieval Arab sailors give some indication of a pre-Islamic society. However, it was only when H.C. Bell visited the island in the 1920s that details of this society emerged in Western scholarship. Several decades later, another scholar called Xavier Romero Frias was instrumental in the compilation of ancient and modern Maldivian folktales. This collection is of great significance as it is a strong source in a largely unexplored field. The stories often contain history, poetry, art, language, and daily life of the ancient Dhivehi people. It is through this information that scholars can gesture as to how the old Maldivian religions functioned in daily life. After living in the Maldives for 13 years, Xavier Romero Frias organized Maldivian folklore into 6 major categories: spirits and monsters, fairy tales, stories with humorous characters, animals' fables, seafaring adventures, and records of semi-historical events. The first of these categories includes some of the most well-known stories which depict the struggle of the islanders against evil spirits. It is in these stories that the ancient animistic beliefs emerge in the behaviors of various heroes. Evil spirits, or Vigani, were the causal agents of both natural and supernatural harm. The hero was a man or woman who could counter the power of the evil spirits with magic. Even with the possibility of deliverance from a sorcerer, the fear of evil spirits produced great anxiety. For example, in one story, a man becomes petrified of an evil spirit whom he believes heard his name when a friend called to him from over deep water. Deep water is understood to be a dwelling place for evil spirits in Maldivian folklore. The man is so afraid that misfortune will come upon him if he leaves his home that he does not leave his house for days even to relieve himself. His home was endowed with charms which warded off the influence of such things. Yet he believed the evil spirit could find him easily were he to leave his home, as he would be passing from protected space into unprotected space. In addition to inauspicious physical locations like deep water and the forest, avoiding activity at night, appeasement through blood sacrifice and worship of local flora and fauna are consistent with other forms of the animistic religion. If someone was harmed by evil spirits, the sorcerer, or pandita, would know how to appease it with ritual magic. It was much more common for Maldivians to have the expectation of wrath rather than benevolence from these spirits. The heroes in this first category battle with problems or enemies of an immaterial nature such as disease, but mostly encounter monsters of a physical nature. These semi-mythical creatures dwelt in the sea, in burial grounds, or in unkempt areas of the island. Occasionally, these myths portray monsters and evil spirits as feminine, cannibalistic, and violent, especially towards children. Though at times these antagonistic creatures are defeated, the tales can also show the hero avoiding rather than confronting or defeating evil. The second category references stories resembling modern fairy tales that may be recognized in films and novels. These stories focus on a young couple, both attractive and charismatic, who unite to counter the opposition of a villain. In these examples, magic and sorcery can be involved, but not usually as the central element in the story. These tales are known to have been told in verse and would have been sung in front of an extended family in a poetic performance. These stories display the romantic scene and gender expectations of traditional Maldivian life. However, these are not the most influential or well-preserved of Maldivian stories and only account for a small percentage of what has been preserved. The third category contains fables which incorporate humorous elements to emphasize a moral lesson. One such example is known as The Poor Man of Nalafushi and His Cow. In this story, a poor man travels from the Mulak Atoll to the capital of Malé to see a cow that had been purchased overseas and brought to the islands. As cattle were rare in the Maldives and only owned by rich men in Malé, this was an unusual occasion. The rich man who owned the cow was very kind and talked at length with the poor man. Feeling pity for him after their discussion, the rich man decided to give the cow to the poor man as a gift and announced his gift excitedly. However, shortly after doing so, the rich man regretted his decision and went back on his word without saying so directly to the poor man. Instead of directly taking the cow back, the rich man gave the poor man a list of things needed to take care of the cow: a pen with wooden posts, good food, and more pasture land. This went on and on until finally, after years, the poor man died without ever receiving his cow. Such stories are used to give Maldivians perspective on their lives, which will allow them to act wisely and honestly. The humorous characteristics of these stories make them memorable and remain some of the most familiar tales to the Dhivehi people. The fourth category observed by Romero Frias are fables that cast sentient animals as the main characters. Many of the local fauna, such as crabs, fish, seabirds, with larger animals like elephants and tigers from India, are characters often met in these stories. These are some of the few oral stories that were referenced in older travelogues. Some of these stories also bear resemblance to the Jatakas and the Panchatantra of India. The similarities include the sharing of virtues and the importance of certain character traits valued by the culture. In addition to the Jatakas, the Sinhalese stories from Sri Lanka are also very similar. These Sinhalese myths, being Buddhist literature, point to the pre-Islamic religious tendencies of the Maldivians. The fifth category are those tales which have the sea as a central theme. Being a group of small islands, the sea was a powerful element in many Dhivehi myths. Fishing stories, the origins of the sea creatures, and travel legends are easily recognizable to many Maldivians. In these examples, the ancient tradition of seafaring is described and refer to a variety of sea craft which were used for trade across the Indian Ocean. Details of the exploits of sailors and their perils at sea were told to the village at their homecoming. However, it was also common to have sailors who left the islands and never returned. Such reports would bring great fear to the community and require religious ceremonies to offset the risk of ocean travel by appeasing wrathful spirits. The Maldivian atolls have very small land masses which are nearly flat and easy to miss on the return voyages from Sri Lanka, Bengal, and India. Maldivian sailors could miss the islands on return voyages by passing unexpectedly through the deep channels between the atolls at night. Just one mistake could be catastrophic, as the sea craft of the period made a return against the westward wind almost impossible. Some of the men who failed to return to the islands would not be able to land until they arrived on the east coast of Africa or in the Seychelles Islands. This was effectively a permanent exile, as journeys back to the Maldives seldom, if ever, occurred. In more recent times, the British, who had colonies in East Africa, would occasionally offer passage back to the Maldives for the few stranded sailors who survived. Even from among these hardened men, few ever completed the return journey. Several Dhivehi proverbs make their way out of these unfortunate events. The proverbs would also contain practical wisdom, such as the location and strategy of navigating coral reef passages. These oral maps would have been important to the early fishing skills that many Maldivians relied on for survival. Some of these proverbs go into detail about the location and the unique customs of specific islands and how to behave when visiting them for trade. These stories, owing to their utility, were eventually published in written format. The final sixth category of Maldivian folklore is the mythological recording of semi-historical events. As mentioned, the tradition of passing down knowledge in the Maldives was primarily oral and lacked written historical sources. As a result, tales of this nature become extremely informative as they can help to reveal what is lacking in the historical annals. However, the historical facts are sometimes subject to the additions of magical and supernatural phenomena as understood by local Maldivians. One example of this kind of story is the chronicle of the monster of Dhivehi. Maldivians reported whenever they spotted sea monsters or fureta in the waters off the coast of their islands. On one occasion on the island of Dhivehi, a villager travelled to the capital to report a sea monster who had come ashore earlier that day. Multiple witnesses were present for this sighting, and so a representative was sent back to investigate. Upon tracing a series of strange tracks, the official located a rare seal which was a possible yet very infrequent visitor to the Maldives and would have had to swim miles from its native habitat. The villagers were put to ease that the creature would return to the water on its own and would not disrupt anything on the island. Such events may not seem notable, but owing to the superstition of the islanders, occasions like these become charged with fear and interpreted as evil omens. As such, even harmless episodes can become the basis for fear and thus religious action, which brought the communities together and created common memories. Disease epidemics, lost sailors, and natural phenomena such as the explosion at Krakatoa have also been the subject of these stories. In addition to the 6 categories mentioned previously, there are meta-myths which prevail in many Maldivian folk tales and form the basis for a mythology of creation. For example, the outlying atoll of Minicoy is believed to be the origin of the Maldivian ancestors and is associated with creation. Located far in the north, Minicoy has been under Indian management since the 17th century and has not experienced Islamification to the same extent as the Maldivian atolls. The oral traditions which were once present on Minicoy have, however, dissipated or gone underground, even despite this. The island still retains significance and was once home to several Buddhist stupas, now in ruins. Another meta-myth has to do with the origin of the coconut palm, without which life on the Maldivian atolls would be nearly impossible. The origin of the coconut palm begins with an epidemic of disease that had spread from island to island until a sorcerer, who was also a practitioner of herbal medicine, created a mixture as a way to revive the dead. The Maldivians at that time practiced certain funeral rites, including a last look at the deceased before they were buried. It was at this point that the sorcerer put his mixture in the mouths of the dead. Though he was unable to raise anyone from the grave, the burial sites began sprouting a new tree which produced edible fruit and husks which could be corded together to make rope. The faces of the dead are still thought to be visible in the 2 eyes and mouth hole of the coconut. As with evil spirits, another of the main antagonists in Maldivian folk religion is disease. Epidemics were historically prevalent in the Maldives as a result of overpopulation on such small land masses. Even mild forms of illness were greatly feared by the villagers, as they were considered to be the threshold of more vicious outbreaks. Additionally, absence of war in Maldivian life made disease the chief cause of death. Upon the first sign of a serious or long-lasting outbreak, fear would grip the village. The kinds of magic used for the treatment would increase in intensity as the situation became more severe. Frequently, the diseased villager would be exiled to another uninhabited island or in isolation away from the village. disease was thought to be a spiritual force, and the afflicted person was thought to bring evil upon the place they visited. Thus, the isolated homes they had in remote areas were avoided by other villagers at all costs. Even the sight of the afflicted or the sound of their cries of pain were thought to carry the disease and increase its spread. Though Maldivians were generally peaceful, the fear of the islanders when encountering sickness resulted in severe mistreatment of the afflicted individuals. Diseases that were physically prominent, such as leprosy, were understood to be the manifestation of great evil and thus treated with the most absolute and drastic measures. This can be observed in the so-called leper islands, which existed even into the 20th century. In his research, Romero Frias recalls an occasion where an elderly man told him of his experience on a leper island for men. In traditional Maldivian societies, the men and women were rarely segregated, yet in the exiled islands they were not permitted to be together so as not to propagate. Sickness was in this sense often a death sentence, and the exiles were left to rot far from their friends and family. In the story recorded by Romero Frias, the man visiting the shores of the leper island was asked to do so against his will by the captain of his vessel. They were searching for a certain section of land that was located on the island, but were forbidden by the government from setting foot on it. The man who eventually decided to go ashore with his captain noted the respect which the lepers had for him and his crew by offering bananas and maintaining a safe distance. Their living conditions were humble, with small huts, no taller than 5 feet, spaced over the tree line. Many of these lepers had progressed to the point of losing their arms and fingers and appeared as though already dead. The Maldivian fear of disease can be seen in the following oral story called Ayani Daita, dated 800 years ago. A plague broke out on the island of Fuamulaku and was so powerful that even the magic of local sorcerers had no power over the disease. As the deaths continued, an ill omen of smoke in the shape of a fish rose out of the lake on the island. The sorcerers began to cast spells against the fish cloud which hovered above the trees, yet the deaths of men, women and children continued. The village elders and the sorcerers convened and unanimously voted to depart at once and leave their island for another. In the frenzy of the panicked migration, a lone elderly woman named Ayani Daita was left behind while preparing food for the journey. She suddenly realized the silence outside her hut, and upon running to the beach, saw the distant sails of the Dhivehi, Maldivian boats, with all the islanders aboard except her. In terror, she ran back to the village only to be stalked by the same Farita, or evil monster, spirit, who had caused the epidemic which killed her friends and drove out her people. The beast attempted to communicate with her and waited at her door, calling her by name. She repelled the beast by throwing boiling syrup into its open mouth as it attempted to taunt her. Though it was a beast with great jaws and sharp teeth, it retreated to the ocean and did not return. Daita knew that the auspicious number of 3 times 40 days would be the first occasion which scouts may reappear to see if the island was still under the evil spirit cloud. She was determined to survive as long as possible, eating the abundance of food and supplies left behind in the disarray. Every day she would climb to the pinnacle of the Buddhist stupa on the island and see whether any ships appeared on the horizon. Finally, a Devi of 12 men appeared and sailed close enough to the island to hear Daita's voice. She frightened them by mistake, and the men, thinking her an evil spirit, nearly turned around again. In her sobbing, she managed to convince them that she herself was not an evil spirit, and the men rowed ashore. She was finally rescued. This myth illuminates the primordial fear of desolation from disease brought about by an evil spirit. Though many of these stories can be found in the work of Romero Frias, there is more to be studied and appreciated from the ancient Maldivian culture. The great diversity of stories and the colorful nature of their content illustrates the uniqueness of these people. Their beliefs, while retreating ever further into history, are still cherished today by many locals. Yet there is real danger of these myths disappearing from the culture entirely, and only a concentrated effort to preserve and study these myths will delay them from vanishing entirely.